Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.
Inhuman Bondage: The Rise and Fall of Slavery in the New World by David Bryan Davis. Dedication to Stephen Mintz, co-author, fellow teacher, the best friend one could ever have. Prologue. In 1770, on the eve of the American Revolution, African-American slavery was legal and almost unquestioned throughout the New World. The ghastly slave trade from Africa was still expanding, and for many decades had been shipping 5 Africans across the Atlantic for every European immigrant to the Americas. An imaginary hemispheric traveler would have seen black slaves in every colony from Canada and New England all the way south to Spanish Peru and Chile. In the incomparably rich colonies of the Caribbean, they often constituted population majorities of 90% or more. But in 1888, 118 years later, when Brazil finally freed all its slaves, the institution had been outlawed throughout the Western Hemisphere. This final act of liberation, building on Abraham Lincoln's emancipation achievement in the American Civil War, took place only a century after the creation of the first anti-slavery societies in human history, initially small groups in such places as Philadelphia, London, Manchester, and New York. The abolition of New World slavery depended in large measure on a major transformation in moral perception, on the emergence of writers, speakers, and reformers, beginning in the mid-18th century, who were willing to condemn an institution that had been sanctioned for thousands of years, and who also strove to make human society something more than an endless contest of greed and power. In this current age of globalization, which has expanded our comprehension of earlier international connections and dependencies, American slavery can no longer be understood in parochial terms, or simply as a chapter in the history of the U.S. South. The peoples of West Africa, as well as those of every maritime nation in Western Europe and every colony in the New World, played a part in the creation of the world's first system of multinational production for what emerged as a mass market, a market for slave-produced sugar, tobacco, coffee, chocolate, dyestuffs, rice, hemp, and cotton. For 4 centuries, beginning in the 1400s with Iberian plantation agriculture in the Atlantic sugar islands off the African coast, the African slave trade was an integral and indispensable part of European expansion and the settlement of the Americas. The demand for labor was especially acute in the tropical and semi-tropical zones that produced the staples and thus the wealth most desired by Europeans. By the mid-1700s, the value of exports to Britain from the British West Indies was more than 10 times that of exports from colonies north of Virginia and Maryland, and the economy of the northern colonies depended in large part on Caribbean markets, which depended in turn on the continuing importation of African labor to replenish an oppressed population that could not sustain itself by natural increase. Inhuman Bondage is designed to illuminate our understanding of American slavery by placing this subject within the much larger contexts of the Atlantic slave system and the rise and fall of slavery in the New World. It is not a comprehensive or encyclopedic survey of slavery in every New World colony, but rather an exploration of America's greatest historical problem and contradiction, which deeply involved such disparate places as Britain, Spain, Haiti, and ancient Rome. For me, the term inhuman has 2 connotations with respect to our subject. After first considering the title of W. Somerset Maugham's famous novel of 1915, Of Human Bondage, and discussing the issue with friends and family, it occurred to me that chattel slavery is the most extreme example we have, not only of domination and oppression, but of human attempts to dehumanize other people. When the Spiritans, a French Catholic missionary group, published in 1999 a special study of the Church and slavery, they chose the title L'esclavage négation de l'humain, Slavery, the Negation of the Human. Under Roman law, as well as in the United States, slaves were deprived of legally recognized spouses or families, and of genuine property ownership. As with most domestic animals, their lowly status was enforced by the threat of almost unlimited physical punishment. As Frederick Douglass put it, after describing the ways that the slave breaker Mr. Covey had tamed him, "I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed, my intellect languished, the disposition to read departed, the cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me, and behold a man transformed into a brute." In an earlier essay on this subject, I have theorized that, given the repeated comparisons of slaves to domestic animals throughout history, and Aristotle wrote that the ox was a poor man's slave, the initial enslavement and bestialization of prisoners of war may well have been modeled on the successful techniques of taming and domesticating wild animals. But some animals could never be domesticated, and even those slaves who at times felt themselves transformed, like Douglass, into brutes, did not lose their essential humanity, a fact that repeatedly underscored the preeminent contradiction of inhuman bondage. Indeed, one of the central and inspiring truths of African American history, a truth dramatized by fugitives like Frederick Douglass, was the way slaves succeeded in asserting their humanity and reinventing their diverse cultures, despite being torn away from their natal African families and societies, despite being continuously humiliated, bought and sold, and often subjected to torture and the threat of death. Thus the word inhuman in this book's title refers to the unconscionable and unsuccessful goal of bestializing, in the form of pets as well as beasts of burden, a class of human beings. This is not meant to deny, as much slave testimony indicates, that some slaves suffered recurrent psychological as well as physical damage. The second aspect of inhuman, when linked with bondage, refers to the special harshness of New World slavery, which white colonists almost always confined, from the very beginning, to Native Americans and then overwhelmingly to black Africans. In both cases to people who were strikingly different in physical appearance as well as in cultural background. Though I do not believe that various historical examples of slavery can be ranked on a scale of severity, there can be no doubt that racial slavery in the Americas widened the gap between slaves and the descendants of slaves in one caste-like group, and non-slave populations that, despite their internal hierarchies, now appeared to be forever free. I should add that racial distinctions became more ambiguous as a result of sexual exploitation and intermixture, which meant that slaves like Frederick Douglass were one-half white. In addition to this racist element, most slaves in the New World became chained to a mercantilist or capitalist system that intensified labor in order to maximize production for distant international markets. And after about 1815, the slave system in the United States became distinctive by virtually closing off the possibility of manumission, which in many societies had been at least a theoretical check on dehumanization, since it showed that a slave was capable of becoming a free person. Despite exceptions, personified by various kinds of highly privileged slaves, American slavery thus became the ultimate form of inhuman bondage. This book originated in an intensive 2-week summer seminar I began teaching in 1994 for high school teachers, mostly from New York City. My scholarly work on slavery began decades earlier, but I taught university courses on very different subjects, since slavery was not yet considered a topic worth an entire semester's course. Still, I was extremely fortunate that my books on what I termed the problem of slavery reached an international academic audience and even non-academic readers. Then, by the 1990s, when there were signs of a new public interest in the subject, we historians began to realize that our scholarly debates, along with the vast number of exciting new discoveries made since the 1960s, were virtually unknown in the nation's schoolrooms and even among most college students. The same could also be said of the general public, despite the prevalence of national historic sites with connections to slavery. This point became especially clear to me in 1988-89, when, as president of the Organization of American Historians, I witnessed altogether new efforts by college and university professors to reach out, include, and communicate with public historians. During the decade before my retirement from teaching at Yale, 2001, nothing seemed more important than the attempt to synthesize and translate the findings of historians and economists regarding American slavery, viewed from a global perspective. The high school teachers I taught for nearly a decade, with the invaluable help of Professor Stephen Mintz, turned out to be extraordinarily excited, appreciative, and highly motivated. Some members of each year's class let me know how they had incorporated slavery and abolition into their high school curricula. I therefore eagerly expanded my teaching notes into a new large lecture course on New World slavery for Yale undergraduates. The extent of public interest as well as ignorance became strikingly evident in 2001 when the New York Times asked me to write an article about the realities of American slavery that would begin on the front page of their Sunday Week in Review, an article that evoked an amazing response from some major public figures, as well as from descendants of both slaves and masters. Inhuman Bondage is the product of this cumulative experience. Since lectures for teachers and college students include no footnotes, even when based on considerable research, it has taken a good bit of time and effort to create this book's extensive endnotes, which are intended to serve, for some readers, as a guide to further learning. I have included more citations and sources for certain broad, complex subjects that I have tried to approach from an original perspective, such as the long-term origins of anti-black racism and New World slavery, 19th century slave conspiracies and revolts, and the Civil War and slave emancipation. The book begins with the dramatic Amistad case in 1839-41, which highlights the multinational character of the Atlantic slave system, from Sierra Leone to Cuba and Connecticut, as well as the involvement of the American judiciary, the presidency, and a former president, the media, and both black and white abolitionists. The difficulties of defining and comprehending the meaning of slavery, given the diversity of historical examples, then take us in Chapter 2 to the Bible, to ancient Babylonia, and to ancient Greco-Roman models, which were especially meaningful in an American age fascinated with neoclassical architecture, the Roman idea of a Senate, and ancient slaves as diverse as Aesop, Spartacus, and the biblical Joseph. Many of the more literate Southern planters also stressed that the ancient Greeks had combined slaveholding with the invention of democracy. Some planters saw themselves as modern Roman Catos, and found a guide for training and managing slaves in Columela's De Re Rustica, a Roman work still widely used in the Middle Ages, and known in later centuries to people who had received a common classical education. In Chapter 3, the graphic testimony of an American free black concerning the grim meaning of racism in 1836 leads us back to the complex ancient and medieval origins of such prejudice. Recent scholarship has immensely enriched our knowledge of medieval European stereotypes of the supposedly black-skinned serfs and peasants, who were darkened by dirt and by labor in the sun, of early Arab stereotypes of black African slaves, millions of whom were transported from East Africa to the Near East, and of the story of the biblical Noah, whose curse subjected all the descendants of Canaan, the son of Noah's own misbehaving son Ham, to the lowliest form of eternal bondage. This confusing biblical passage became for many centuries a major justification for black slavery. But my discussion of anti-black prejudice also considers the very ambivalent messages conveyed by European art and sculpture, and culminates with the modern forms of anti-black racism that appear in the writings of such figures of the Enlightenment as David Hume, Thomas Jefferson, and Immanuel Kant, and then reach a symbolic climax in the 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica. Chapter 4, How Africans Became Integral to New World History, rejects various economic deterministic theories and emphasizes the contingent ways in which greed and a desire for profit became fused with issues of religion and ethnic identity, as in the early 18th century anthem, Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves. Britons never will be slaves. Written at a time when thousands of Britons were in fact being enslaved by Muslim Barbary corsairs, who raided England's and continental Europe's coastlines, and also seized captives from countless European ships. Before turning to African slave dealers and Euro-African negotiations on the West African coast, The reader will learn about changing sources of slave labor in the late medieval Mediterranean, as well as the Italian and German bankers and merchants who ultimately provided a capitalist foundation for the later Atlantic slave system and its production of sugar, coffee, rice, and tobacco, some of which created, by the mid-1700s, the first mass consumer markets in the world. Along with offering vivid descriptions of the atrocious overpacking and dehydration on slave ships crossing the Atlantic, I argue that racial slavery became an intrinsic and indispensable part of New World settlement, not an accident or a marginal shortcoming of the American experience. We must face the ultimate contradiction that our free and democratic society was made possible by massive slave labor. Chapter 5 considers the Portuguese colony of Brazil, and then the Caribbean, as the true centers of the Atlantic slave system, which concentrated on the production of sugar, and later molasses and rum. Chapter 6 then moves on to the spread of racial slavery to colonial North America, which, surprisingly, received only 5 to 6% of the African slaves shipped across the Atlantic, but whose slaves developed an almost unique natural and rapid rate of population growth, freeing the later United States from a need for further African imports. While slave labor has often been seen as economically backward and almost feudalistic, I stress the fact that plantation agriculture, even in Brazil, resembled factories in the field, and with its carefully structured gang labor, anticipated in many ways the assembly lines and agribusinesses of the future. Planters, particularly in Brazil, but also in the United States, adopted a facade of patriarchal paternalism that helped them reconcile pre-capitalist traditions with the inherent brutality and attempts at dehumanization symbolized by what I term inhuman bondage. I also devote attention to the way that blacks created their own Afro-New World cultures and devised means for continuing negotiation with their owners and drivers. It was this negotiation that sustained slave productivity and allowed the system to work and even prosper for many centuries, despite slave resistance. The opportunity to negotiate in no way mitigates the intrinsic oppression of slavery. But slaves often did win slightly more land and time for growing their own provisions, or managed their own market exchanges and conducted their own marriages and burials. Urban slave women in such cities as Rio de Janeiro and Charleston, South Carolina, achieved remarkable freedom to run outdoor public markets, where they sold all kinds of food and handicrafts for the profit of their owners. It soon becomes clear that in a single colony the differences between urban slaves, plantation workers, privileged slave artisans, and household servants could be as significant as any differences between separate colonies or New World regions. Some slaves in Connecticut or Brazil would have eagerly changed places with some of those in Virginia or South Carolina, and of course the reverse would also be true. Yet as chapters 5 and 6 make clear, there were enormous differences between slavery in colonial New York and Virginia, and in 1770, there were more black slaves in New York than in Georgia, to say nothing of the difference between having patriarchs in Brazil and absentee English owners and hired professional managers in most of the British West Indies. Chapters 7 and 8 consider the problem of slavery in the American Revolution, and then the very different impact of the French and Haitian revolutions, both within a broad international context that begins with the French defeat in the 7 Years' War and ends with the Napoleonic Wars, including Napoleon's restoration of slavery, and the Latin American Wars of Independence. Few historians of the American Revolution have recognized the central role of slavery, a subject that ranges from the issue of freeing and arming slave soldiers to the escape of many thousands of slaves behind British lines, as well as the glaring ideological contradiction that led slaves in the northern states to petition for their freedom, using the same natural rights language that the whites employed against so-called British tyranny. It was this contradiction that helped reformers in the North to pass laws for very gradual slave emancipation, thus pushing the new northern states in the direction of free soil. It is also true that few historians have recognized that John Adams's administration gave crucial secret aid to Toussaint Louverture and the blacks' cause of Haitian independence from France. Chapter 8 begins with the famous former slave and abolitionist Frederick Douglass proclaiming in 1893 that the brave sons of Haiti struck for the freedom of every black man in the world. But I also stress that for a later age obsessed with the problems of freedom and order, the Haitian Revolution suggested the unleashing of pure id. The Haitian blacks' defeat of the best armies of the British, the Spanish, and the French inspired black rebels in Virginia, Cuba, Barbados, South Carolina, and Venezuela, and hovered like a weapon of mass destruction in the minds of slaveholders as late as the American Civil War. Having viewed this extremely broad and crucial context, we move in chapters 9 and 10 to the heart of the book, Slavery in the 19th Century South. Drawing on the vast scholarship of recent decades, we begin with the perceptions of foreign travelers, and then consider the thesis that this institution of extreme inequality made it possible for white Americans to perceive their other relationships among whites of different social classes as being relatively equal. These chapters give serious attention to such diverse subjects as black slaveholding planters, the rise of the Cotton Kingdom, the daily life of ordinary slaves, the highly destructive internal, long-distance slave trade, often by ship around the Florida Keys to New Orleans, pro-slavery thought, the sexual exploitation of slaves, the emergence of an African-American culture, in which oral traditions became a sanctuary of human dignity, the testimony of slaves, dramatically symbolized by the letter of a literate slave wife, written to her husband as she and their child are about to be sold away, and the declining status and persecution of free blacks as an ominous weather vane with respect to a post-emancipation America. After such detailed exposure to the appalling inhumanity of the system, the reader should welcome Chapter 11, Some 19th Century Slave Conspiracies and Revolts. This is a subject that calls out for careful comparisons. We therefore place several American conspiracies and revolts next to the three huge slave insurrections in the British West Indies: Barbados in 1816, Demerara in 1823, and Jamaica in 1831. Since thousands of slaves were involved in these events, what seems most incredible, especially when compared with the massacres of Nat Turner in Virginia and the bloodshed of 18th century Caribbean uprisings, is the fact that hardly any whites were killed. Clearly, the slave leaders in the British West Indies exercised great restraint and discipline, putting planters in the stocks, for example, that had once been used to punish slaves, because they were aware of a growing and powerful anti-slavery sentiment in the British mother country, a sympathetic public that would be alienated by any vengeful slaughter of whites. The open cursing and growling of West Indian whites, who were livid and almost paranoid over news of the British anti-slavery movement, conveyed much information to the kind of privileged head slaves who led these insurrections. The role of white missionaries was also extremely important in Demerara and Jamaica. I use these examples as a way to account for the infrequency and counterproductive effects of slave conspiracies in America, which, unlike those in the British Caribbean, could not really address a powerful central government that was sensitive to a large and influential abolitionist public. But ironically, white Southerners ignored the restraint of the British West Indian slave rebels and interpreted the massive insurrections as the inevitable result of abolitionist agitation. My thesis regarding British Caribbean revolts merges naturally into Chapter 12, Explanations of British Abolitionism. Although general readers are understandably uninterested in most debates carried on by historians, the story of British abolitionism is exceptional because it raises profound and universal questions about the nature and possibility of collective moral actions in human history. If, as most experts now agree, it was highly contrary to Britain's economic self-interest to peacefully emancipate 800,000 colonial slaves in the 1830s and pay a staggering sum of taxpayers' money as compensation to the slaves' owners or creditors, how can we explain the success of this pioneering do-good movement for radical social reform? As contemporary foreign critics and later historians remind us, Britain's moral record with respect to workers in the Industrial Revolution, to say nothing of Britain's exploitation of India and Ireland and response to the latter's disastrous famine in the 1840s, hardly conveys the image of a benevolent or sinless society. Therefore, after presenting a concise summary of the history of the British anti-slavery movement from the 1780s to the 1830s, I have felt it necessary to discuss the debates among historians and then highlight the importance of religious changes beginning with the Quakers, the rise of various philanthropic movements, and the need to uplift and dignify the concept of free wage labor. Abolitionism in Britain leads logically in Chapter 13 to abolitionism in America. Here, despite much crucial transatlantic influence and exchange, one must focus on a different religious phenomenon, the Second Great Awakening of the early 19th century and its generation of various movements for moral reform. After noting the relevance of rapid socio-economic change, the so-called market revolution and the transportation revolution, I underscore the leadership of free blacks in opposing the movement for black colonization, which was long fused with whites' attacks on slavery, as well as the quest for human perfectibility by redeeming man from the dominion of man. American abolitionism was always confined to a small minority, in contrast to the British movement, and I suggest that William Lloyd Garrison's eccentricities and extremist rhetoric may have deterred many potential converts. But ultimately, the invasion of the North by Southern owners and agents, who as a result of the infamous Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 could draft any white males into a posse in order to capture an alleged runaway slave, increased the opponents of the now peculiar institution. The Christian passion aroused by the vision of slavery as the essence of sin can be seen in the famous lines of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, "As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free." A similar but more universalized sense of slavery, guilt, and death appears in the immortal words of Lincoln's second inaugural address, with which I conclude this chapter. The politics of slavery in the United States, the subject of Chapter 14, is so vast, complex, and underappreciated that I must be highly selective and avoid a numbing clutter of facts. I do take account of the wider international context, beginning with the Napoleonic Wars and the collapse of most of Spain's empire in the Americas, which undermined slavery from Mexico to Chile, but had the reverse effect on Cuba. A succession of American administrations was determined to prevent France, or especially Britain, still seen as America's natural enemy, from acquiring territories in the former Spanish world. America's expansion into Louisiana, Florida, and Texas involved the expansion and consolidation of slavery and provided enormous markets for some of the excess numbers of blacks in the East, especially Virginia. Partly because of the clause in the Constitution that gave the South added political representation for 3/5 of its slave population, Southern leaders increasingly challenged restrictions on the westward expansion of slavery and the creation of new slave states. Southern slaveholding presidents governed the nation for 50 of the 72 years between the inaugurations of Washington and Lincoln, and before Lincoln, none of the Northern presidents challenged the slaveholding interests. Since slaveholders also tended to dominate the Senate and Supreme Court, it is not surprising that America long had a pro-slavery foreign policy, typified by the case of the slave ship Creole, or that the succession of major political compromises beginning with the Missouri Crisis of 1819-21 largely favored the South. This chapter gives a detailed examination of the Missouri Crisis, the effects of British abolition on the Southern tendency to overreact to the supposed danger of Northern reformers, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and the reasons for Southern secession after Lincoln's election in 1860. Chapter 15, The Civil War and Slave Emancipation, proceeds in a somewhat unorthodox way. Beginning with the Union capture of the Confederate capital of Richmond in April 1865, and with the way that black Union troops freed a bevy of slaves in a Richmond jail, I emphasize the truly revolutionary meaning of the Civil War, reinforced by the fact that the Union confiscated without compensation a hitherto legally accepted form of property that was worth an estimated $3.5 billion in 1860 dollars, about $68.4 billion in 2003 dollars. Most of the other emancipations of slaves in the Western Hemisphere provided slaveholders with some compensation, often in the form of unpaid labor from the freeborn children of slaves who were required to work until age 18, or a good bit older, or a period of unpaid apprenticeship for former slaves. Even Haiti had to pay France a staggering sum of compensation in order to gain diplomatic recognition and the right to trade. I then move on to the way this revolutionary meaning of the Civil War was repressed and transformed from the 1880s to the late 1950s, before I turn to the story of President Lincoln and slave emancipation. I believe that most readers will more deeply appreciate the issue of fugitive slave contrabands, the centrality of the slaveholding border states, and the fortuitous series of events that led to the Battle of Antietam and to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, if they first know how racism and the goal of national reconciliation later led to a romanticized view of the antebellum South, and an interpretation of the Civil War as a great military Super Bowl contest between blue and gray heroes. As my colleague David Blight has compellingly shown in his prize-winning book, Race and Reunion, this was a memory in which race and slavery were never mentioned. Fortunately, this tradition of denial never wiped out an emancipationist tradition, kept alive by such black writers as W.E.B. Du Bois, which helped inspire the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and which transformed at least our academic understanding of the rise and fall of racial slavery. This book, I hope, will join the small shelf of works that have begun to convey our academic understandings to a wider public. In the epilogue, I first consider the influence of the American Civil War on the slave emancipations in Cuba and Brazil in the 1880s. After describing the highly distinctive ways in which slavery was abolished in these last two bastions of plantation agriculture, I briefly survey the persistence in the 20th century and beyond of various forms of coerced labor. Above all, I conclude, we should consider the meaning in the early 21st century of the historically unique anti-slavery movements that succeeded in overthrowing, within the space of a century, systems of inhuman bondage that extended throughout the hemisphere, systems that were still highly profitable as well as productive. But this positive message of willed moral achievement must also be linked with the need to recognize the heavy and complex legacies of America's greatest historical contradiction.
Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.